Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to a truly exciting episode. We're tackling one of the most consequential shifts happening in climate adaptation right now. Something everyone in this field is feeling, whether you're in state government, a nonprofit, academia, or working directly with communities. The federal climate architecture is retreating. Agencies that once provided data, funding, coordination, and technical support are scaling back their climate work or stopping it altogether, leaving practitioners scrambling to fill critical gaps. But here's the good news. A new ecosystem is emerging. Climate groups are stepping up with tools, datasets, guidance, and on-the-ground support that are keeping this field alive and moving. In this episode, we're going to explore those resources, where they are, how to use them, and what they mean for the future of adaptation. We'll start with a big picture look at what the federal retreat actually means. Then you'll hear from innovators who are already filling the void with practical climate adaptation services that communities can use right now. Before we get started, I want to share that this episode was generously sponsored by the CO2 Foundation. This is the second of a three-part series sponsored by the Foundation. The vision of the CO2 Foundation is a near future of effective climate action to reduce the risk of catastrophic weather and to catalyze community climate resilience strategies. A tremendous thanks for their continued support. Okay, let's get into this episode. Hey, Adapters, welcome back to the podcast. To kick things off for this episode, I'm joined by frequent contributor Dr. Jesse Keenan at Tulane University, one of the country's leading voices on climate adaptation. I wanted to start with Jesse because he can help us understand the big picture, what it means when federal leadership on climate adaptation begins to fade, and how that shift is reshaping the landscape for everyone working in the sector. Hi, Jesse. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me. And it's I'm not sure I'm a leading at climate adaptation person or in that class of individuals, but I sure do learn a lot from being here. So thanks for having me.
Oh, don't be bashful here. All right. First off, for people that aren't familiar with you, even though you've done a bunch of episodes with me, give us a little bit of your background before we jump into this.
I cover climate adaptation in the built environment. And that covers formal structural policies, plans, designs, engineering, models. I cover a full range of everything but the kind of sociology of it all. Yeah. And I've covered this working as a professor, working in policy and planning. I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. I worked for governors. I done just about everything you can do in this world at my age. So I feel like I've learned something along the way. I'm probably not great at any of it, but I've at least had the benefit of doing a lot of it.
As you just described, you've been doing this adaptation work for years. How would you describe this moment we're in as federal climate leadership pulls back?
Yeah, federal government played an important role in shaping disaster risk reduction, certainly hazard mitigation, but within a broader umbrella of adaptation. There was plenty of good work that was done at NIST, CISA, at FEMA, and USDA, even at Social Security Administration. In general, those federal roles and responsibilities were internal. They were designed mostly to shape their statutory obligations and congressional obligations were and are. And this is like they're adapting to provide delivery and governmental services. But their external audience is limited. And in that context, the federal government has played a pretty minimal role in climate adaptation. But really, state and local governments have been the ones who've really been driving this work for a number of years. It's grossly incomplete. It's mostly jurisdictions that have the wealth, the resources, the population density to make these kinds of investments, hard and soft investments in the planning and the implementation of these things along the way. So the ball's fully in their corner now. And it's happening at a time when federal transfers are declining. Those federal transfers are getting cut off. And municipalities all across this country are entering a new era of its austerity. Now, the good news is that they have a lot of cash saved up since COVID helped to add to those rainy day funds. So right now, they're burning down the rainy day funds, but there's a point in time. But now I'd say more so than ever, at least in several generations, we're really facing some severe constraints on the delivery of government services. And what I worry about is even though the ball's in their corner, and maybe there's some liberty associated with that from state and local governments, right? They've got to make some hard decisions about where they spend their money. And that's not going to be in favor of the goals and values of adaptation, climate adaptation as we see it. I think we're at a really critical point
Right now, what federal tools and data sets and programs are essential to adaptation work that are being pulled back?
I'd say everything, right? And when we think about the climate.gov and the aggregation of what climate.gov and the contributions it has made now for many years, we think about the billion-dollar disasters. We think about really an ecosystem of primary data that's been shaping public, private, civic action, engagement, consumer literacy, public communications, private sector decision-making. All of these different classes of stakeholders are shaped by an enormous array of data and information that is in some form or fashion originated out of the primary measurement science applications, satellites, and flows of data and validated data from the federal government. And we're losing all of that, or a good portion of that has already been lost in some measure. Now, is it lost? Yes, it exists here and there, but it's the continuity of that measurement, of those measurements and of that data that I think is most troubling along the way. So I'm not sure we fully appreciate the extent to what is missing at this point, but I think we can recognize at this stage that it's a great deal.
Describe what a more decentralized adaptation ecosystem looks like. This truly is going to be this moment where we're going to decentralize this in a big way.
Yeah, so I was mentioning state and local governments. That's the kind of impetus as a formal kind of structural policy planning perspective on this relating to adaptation. But of course, there's the private sector, there's consumers, there's many different stakeholders here who are using this information in its varying degrees of certainty and uncertainty to make all different types of decisions, or to just be generally informed as a political agent in the process of guiding local politics sometimes. So I think this decentralization that we see is a little bit of, if it is available, if it is transparent, if it meets the values of public science, then I think we can applaud it and recognize it for what it is. But of course, we run the problem of the climate intelligence arms race, where a lot of this stuff becomes privatized outside the bounds of peer-reviewed science. And you create an asymmetry between the haves and the have-nots in terms of the access to this information. So there's good and bad things, better and maybe not so good things about this. But in general, they're just gaps. And those gaps can't be filled fundamentally by going to our European counterparts or relying on citizen science or whatever it may be. We can fill lots of gaps, but there are some gaps that I just don't think we will be able to fundamentally fill. And we should be cognizant of where those gaps are. So optimistic on one end, but also realistic on another end.
But again, you've mentioned states and cities, but let's talk about the private sector and even foundations. What are you seeing out there in regards to those entities stepping it up?
I think in the broader climate intelligence arms race in the private sector, what we see and have seen is continued investment in R&D. It's leveled off there for a while in recognition that the SEC disclosure rules weren't going to go forward, and that was going to inhibit some market share growth. But in general, the technology and the commercialization is moving forward. And there's also been some sorting, or in terms of like companies that don't really add value with their underlying products and services being pushed out, and those that do rising up and taking more market share. So I think things are still moving forward, and that feels good. And I think that work's going to continue to move forward in the United States and globally as well.
We're in this new environment, but what skills or mindsets do you think the next generation of adaptation professionals will need in this new environment? And you deal with a lot of younger people in the university too.
I think there's a lot of skills, but it's really how do you make decisions in the context of uncertainty, deep uncertainty? How do we frame and shape heuristics and the various aspects of decision making and decision science? How does that play out in the things that we manage, the relationships that we have, in the underlying sort of battles day to day, in the exercise of trying to understand what comes next? It's something that requires a fair amount of, I think, training ultimately in practice, and a certain sensitivity and acknowledgement that, and I think we're going to see this on the episode today, that we're all translators, right? We're just translating, and we're trying to bridge different domains of knowledge. And that's the real challenge, is we can't be subject matter experts in everything, or could barely even do it in some of our core sectors as it relates to adaptation. But our real role is how do we deal with this uncertainty, but also bridge across disciplines, across sectors, as translators of this knowledge and information to help people make decisions. That's the challenge, and that's the role. And I think that's what we're going to get into today with this episode.
What would you recommend for the adaptation community to stay coordinated? Because the federal government, through their various agencies, they had communication departments talking about these things, and that got stopped pretty much overnight. So what are some things out there to keep us thinking together and sharing information?
I think the various conferences, public convenings globally, but also in the United States around climate, around adaptation are probably more important than ever. It's not so much who you're following on Blue Sky or what starter pack and adaptation you get or whatever that is. It's about meeting people, talking to people, seeing what's going on, seeing something that's totally outside of your area of competence or expertise or literacy. It's really, I think, the socialization now probably more important than ever. And there's a lot of public programming out there that helps reinforce that. Now, I know that's not everybody can afford to do that in terms of time and energy, and we have limited bandwidth. But I think it's more important now than ever that we continue to move forward. Really, there's just the socialization of adaptation professionals and allied professionals.
Even though there's all this uncertainty, and I'm sure it's very negative for a lot of folks, I think adaptation is still trying to figure out its identity. And so do you think this moment is actually an opportunity to reimagine sort of climate leadership in this space beyond that federal framework?
I think adaptation is everything. Adaptation happens at so many different scales of actors over different time horizons. It's such a broad area. I think when we talk about professional identity, I think it's in the context of planners and policymakers doing pretty formal things relating to the identification of risks and exposure and how we mitigate that and ultimately drive some transformative or incremental investments or project-based orientation to how we address this in the interest of reducing vulnerability or reducing the average annual losses or whatever those metrics are that we set for ourselves. That's all just one class of work. But of course, this exists in every adaptation's happening in real time at consumers, at households, at families, at nonprofits, at grocery stores, or the food chain. It's happening in every sector, right? It's happening. And so I think in a way, it's so expansive in how we're adapting as a constant state of our cultural practices, but also our economic evolution that it's unwieldy, both as a concept, but also as a kind of professional identity. But I think among those that are working in the built environment, in the public sector, for local governments, state governments, yada, that core component of adaptation in the United States, there's already, I think, a robust set of practices, knowledge, and we know what we need to do. It's about galvanizing and communicating and building coalitions of people that can move that forward as a political exercise and as a social exercise. And that's the value of all of this climate data and information.
All right, Jesse, let's get started with this episode with the other experts coming on. We're going to hear from folks actually filling in some of these gaps that you've been mentioning, and they're offering data and funding and guidance. And yeah, just cue us up here. What's coming up next?
Well, listen, we're about to hear from Probable Futures, climate.us, Georgetown. These are the major entities that are shaping this conversation, but also working really hard to resource and to communicate and to be engaged as part of our daily Google searches for the information we're looking for. And that sounds overly simplistic, but at the end of the day, there's a huge ecosystem of knowledge. And I think I'm really excited that we've got coming on today some major and important contributors to that along the way.
All right, Jesse, thanks for coming on as always.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Rebecca Lindsay. Rebecca is the co-founder and editor of climate.us and the former editor of the government website, climate.gov. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You got a bit of a story to tell there, and I want you to just start us off. And so we have this climate.us and climate.gov. What's your background? And let's just jump into what are you doing there with climate.us?
My background is that I was the lead editor at climate.gov, which was a NOAA website for almost 15 years. I was there building it. We built it from scratch, myself and several of my teammates. And starting in the new administration this year, we began to suspect that our site was not going to survive. And that became very true. I was fired in February as part of the mass purge of probationary employees at NOAA. And then about 2 or 3 months later, the remainder of our team, who are all full-time contractors, were laid off from their contract. The word came down from the political appointees down through our chain of command that contract that our team was on would be renewed, but only after all of the people who produced content for climate.gov were removed from it. And that was really the end of our operations. And then in June, we learned that NOAA politicals had ordered that our homepage, the climate.gov homepage, be redirected to noaa.gov/climate. The significance of that is that Climate.gov was situated and operated out of one of NOAA's science offices. Our editorial policy called for scientists to review our content and approve it before it was published. The NOAA.gov website is directly controlled by the Office of Communications, which is headed by political appointees. And it was that last decision that they made to redirect the climate.gov homepage to a page that is under the direct control of political appointees that really motivated us to want to come up with an alternative. We were concerned that either they were going to take climate.gov completely offline or worse, possibly use it to spread misinformation about climate. A few of us who had not immediately had to go out and get other jobs decided to band together and launch what we hope to be a nonprofit successor to climate.gov, climate.us.
That's a horrifying story, but we're going to pivot now to the positive that you have there. You've launched climate.us, and we're going to dig into that. First off, who is your target audience? And I'm assuming there's a lot of overlap with climate.gov, but who are you hoping to use this resource?
We want to target 4 specific audiences: the science-interested public, formal and informal educators, decision makers, and people who are seeking data, or who are seeking data-driven answers to questions.
What kind of feedback, because this is all happening very fast, what kind of feedback are you hearing for, like, people? Have you sensed that shift from climate.gov users over to climate.us?
We have sensed enthusiasm from former readers of climate.gov and others, both internationally and in the U.S. Mainly, it's encouragement and donations to our crowdsourcing campaign. What we did do was we took a pause and a pivot, and we decided that we were going to rescue another very important climate resource before we got to climate.gov. And we cloned and stood up a copy of the 5th National Climate Assessment, which is the most recent of the authoritative reports on the state of climate impacts on the U.S. It's a congressionally mandated report. It's put out by the U.S. GCRP, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and their site was taken down by the Trump administration this summer, including all previous versions of the National Climate Assessment. We decided that it would be very important for the most recent one, at least, to be online and available to Americans at this point in time. And so that is the first rescue that we did.
This is an ongoing process, and there are going to be additional resources that you're hoping to bring online. What will be some of those, in the coming months and such?
We're going to start with climate.gov's most read and most shared and most cited content, which tend to be the Global Climate Dashboard. We have an event tracker, which is a map-based interactive for stories about the influence of both natural and human-caused climate change on newsworthy extreme events, our data snapshots, map collection, educational resources. We're going to bring back the Climate Literacy Guide, which we were forced to take down early in the Trump administration because the latest version of it had concepts, a literacy concept that included the importance of making sure that climate solutions were equitable and fair. Anything that had to do with diversity, inclusion, climate justice, anything like that, we were forced to scrub from climate.gov in January or February of this year. So we're going to be bringing back, those are some of the most important resources we're going to be bringing back.
Fantastic. And so this must be a pivot for you, that there's all these sort of rules and policies in place when you're actually working for the government. And now that you're not working for the government, what kinds of topics or resources are you prioritizing? You just listed some ones that you want to bring on, but you obviously are not going to bring them all. But it must be different for you, that it's not the same sort of process of like approval and such.
That is true. And while this is a very unsettling and unnerving time, it's also an exciting time because, as you say, we can potentially expand our scope to topics that weren't appropriate for a government website. For example, NOAA's mission didn't have a lot to do with climate mitigation, with strategies for stopping global warming. So that was an area where we didn't have much content. And we're very excited about the possibility that we can explore all the evidence-based solutions for how we can confront this climate problem that we have. That will be an exciting new area for us. And it also frees us up to potentially partner more broadly, internationally perhaps, with states, with tribal governments, with communities that want information about climate. We think this is going to really provide freedom and opportunities to improve climate.gov now that we are outside the federal fence.
I know some of those restraints when I worked for the federal government. All right, give us like a day-to-day kind of thing. What does it actually take to maintain and update the site? And you just described all these things you want to bring online. Are you just communicating with folks?
Well, right now, we are almost wholly focused on fundraising. We have been the three of us who are former climate.gov team members who have not yet gotten new jobs. We have been doing this as a volunteer process over the summer. We have a small fellowship that's covering a couple months of salary for us, but when that ends, we will be out of work again. We have to be able to hire web developers and pay for our domain name. And so we're focused on crowdsource funding right now. And we're also writing a business prospectus and trying to pitch the idea of climate.us to philanthropic foundations. So day to day, we are doing a lot of things that were not part of our day to day 6 months ago.
I have some more questions, but we might as well just hop into that. So if my listeners, I have people from foundations who listen, just a lot of adaptation professionals, what advice would you give them? Let's say it's a foundation, they reach out you directly, but like this crowdsourcing, if an individual wants to donate, could you give them some options?
Sure. The easiest way to donate to us is just come and visit the climate.us webpage. There's a link there to how people can donate if they want to be part of our crowdsourcing. If people want to talk about, if foundations want to talk about a more programmatic scale funding, they can send me an email. You can email the project at info@climate.us. I guess what I would say is there's a lot of attention and focus right now, and rightly so, on preserving data and preserving scientists, actual scientific research. And I know philanthropies are struggling to make sense of everything that is under attack and everything that could be lost. I would like to ask them to broaden their view a little bit and think about a site like climate.gov, whose purpose was really to build a bridge between the world of science and the rest of the world. That sort of interpretation and context and making meaning of what science has discovered, that's crucial to make sure that the country is getting the real benefits, the full benefits of scientific research. I would just make a little plea to take a wider view of the science enterprise and consider supporting something like climate.us.
I have quite a few international listeners because you're no longer associated with the federal government. Can you take international donations?
We absolutely can take international donations, and we were not anticipating that we would have interest from outside of the U.S. originally. And so then we began to get a flood of emails saying, hey, I can't donate in euros, or can you make it possible to do an international donation? And so we had to scurry, put our heads together with our fiscal sponsor and get those currencies added. So yes, people can definitely make international donations. And if your currency is not listed there, just send us an email and we'll figure out how to get it added.
Yeah, and I just encourage, I have listeners like in Australia and the United Kingdom and such, and they work for the government there at different levels. And I'm sure they have all sorts of data work that they're doing. And so just, guys, it's worth reaching out and maybe there's some data sharing and there's opportunities there. Obviously, this is, again, a great tragedy that climate.gov got taken offline in the way it did. But as you alluded to earlier, has this process taught you anything about climate.gov that you could do better? So if in a more friendly administration comes back in, are there things that you're mentally noting, oh, we should do this different? And I know you described the kind of the freedoms that you have, but are there things you do differently?
One of the disappointments that we always carried about climate.gov is that we had hoped that it would not just be a NOAA site, but that it would become a portal and a cornerstone for all federal science agencies that are in the climate research domain. That never happened, in part because it was just very hard to achieve collaborations for something. I'm trying to think of the diplomatic way to say this. Communications efforts at federal agencies always have an element of sort of programmatic goals, people trying to promote the science that is taking place at their agency. That's understandable. It's even probably important for that to happen because one of the points of communicating about federal science is so that the public can understand what their taxpaying, what their money is being used for. So it's not necessarily inherently bad, but it was unproductive for trying to build an interagency website for climate information for the public, because everyone wanted their piece to sit at their own website, at their own agency. And so I think one thing I've learned is it would be great if the government ever swings back and wants to get into the business of climate engagement with the public and climate communication. It would be really great if we could all try harder to make a truly interagency version of climate.gov.
And I agree. My own experience in state and federal government is that there's so many layers, and sometimes it just snuffs the innovation or the life out of communication efforts when you go through it. And I get it. It's about quality control. And you have to be risk averse, but maybe there's that, as you had mentioned earlier, that opportunity for you guys to do something a little bit different. So that a silver lining to all this negative news.
And I also think, Doug, what has happened to climate.gov in this administration is its own proof that perhaps a site as important as climate.gov, which is providing sort of basic climate literacy information and trying to help people connect them with data that they need and help bridge that gap between science and the everyday world. I think this is evidence that sort of site should probably always be free from political interference. There should be a component of climate science engagement and literacy that remains outside of the federal government. But I think it's possible that partnerships with government at all levels would allow everyone a chance to contribute what their strengths are. So that's how I see how climate.us might evolve in the future if we end up with an administration that is better able to understand the reality of the climate challenges we're facing.
I think there'll be all sorts of reforms in future administrations, not just this climate information, but other information where
Yes.
There's going to be hopefully top to bottom reform of how government operates. On that note, so you're well-funded, money starts to come in, you're getting to do a lot of your hiring people and such. What does success look like for climate.us 1 year from now if all those things start to happen?
Goodness, if everything starts to happen a year from now, we will have a fully launched website with content that has been developed in careful consultation with the different audiences that we're targeting. We will have at least 4 audience-focused content engagement teams, one for the news and feature section, one for teaching climate, one for maps and data, and one for resilience and planning related adaptation activities. So we will have at least 20-person team, everybody focused on best serving their audiences. And we will have partnerships with others that are doing great, interesting, useful work in this space already. And we'll be sharing resources and sharing expertise so that we're not competing with each other. Yeah. And we will have maybe not 15 million page views. We'll be on the track to growing our audience again. And we have 15 years of climate.gov of building a relationship with the American public and letting them trust us to provide information. It's going to take time. I hope it doesn't take us 15 years to rebuild that trust. So I'm hoping that a year from now, we would be well on our way.
All right, Rebecca, thanks for coming on the podcast. Thanks for what you're doing. I'm sure this has been a tumultuous year for you. I'm going to have links in the show notes for this episode, and people will be able to dig in. And if you want to consider donating, please do. But thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Annie Bennett. Annie is an associate director for the Adaptation program with the Georgetown Climate Center. Hi, Ann. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about some of the resources that you guys have there. But just first off, more broadly, what is the Georgetown Climate Center?
Well, the Georgetown Climate Center is a nonpartisan climate policy resource center. It was founded in 2009 at the request of leaders from state government who recognized that there were federal discussions going on around climate policy, and they really wanted to make sure that those were informed by lessons from the states. And there's a greater need for kind of understanding and partnership across all levels of government. We provide legal, policy, and process support to inform policy development. And a lot of our work focuses on roles for different levels of government in policy development to both mitigate and adapt to climate change, how different levels of government can work together and what they can do under existing authority. It's really a proactive and practical approach that we take. We in terms of how we work with state and local governments on policy development. And we do a lot of convening to help break down communication barriers and facilitate better collaboration. And then we develop tools and resources that can help government practitioners make decisions about different policy options that they might want to adopt to tackle a particular challenge.
You guys go way back. I've been following you for years. There's been a lot of adaptation resources coming online in the last 5 years, but you guys are much older than that. So that's fantastic. And so let's focus a little bit more about the adaptation section that they're doing. And I'm going to cue you up for the specific adaptation resources, but just tell us a bit more broadly about the adaptation program and your role in it, because you're an adaptation director there.
Sure. Adaptation means a lot of different things to different people, I think, which really just goes to show how climate change is a challenge that touches everything. And for us, it's really about people and communities and helping them be safer and more resilient in the face of impacts like extreme flooding, worsening heat and drought, and more intense wildfires. And we come at this work by focusing on how state and local governments can create policies that protect communities and also make sure that the infrastructure that we all rely on a day-to-day basis can function as it's intended and for as long as it's intended to keep people safe and provide services for people. Our team's work is really guided by 4 overarching strategies that we think are really important to do this work, which are focusing on governance, so how different organizational approaches can better facilitate adaptation, policymaking, and investment decisions. Safer development policies and how governments are helping people avoid living in or developing in riskier areas. Funding and financing, how governments can spend limited resources more wisely to ensure that the investments that they're making are resilient into the future. And then doing a good job at telling the adaptation story to help shape public conversation and make sure that the government practitioners that we're working with, as well as their constituents, understand what the risks are and what they can do about it.
You have this adaptation clearinghouse. If you're just coming on the website, you go to this clearinghouse, and then obviously there's a bunch of information. So walk us through that, the whole clearinghouse.
Sure. The clearinghouse is really a flagship resource for us. It's been around since 2012, I think, but it looks a whole lot different now than it initially did. It's an online library with over 3,000 adaptation resources and primarily focused on planning, law, and policy related resources. We've done a lot of work over the years to hopefully make it more user-friendly and able to deliver the resources that people are looking for. And we've, this year in particular, done a lot of thinking about how the clearinghouse fits in the greater landscape of adaptation resources and doubling down on our focus on law and policy and what governments can do to help adapt to climate change. When you come to the clearinghouse, you can explore the resources in a wide range of ways. You can do keyword searches. You can search by a particular state or region. You can explore specific sectors if you're interested in a particular sector. You can look at specific impacts if you want to look at resources related to how other jurisdictions have approached flooding issues. You can do that. You can look at things by jurisdictional focus. If you are a state government practitioner and you only want to look at things that other states have done, you can do that, or same for local government. It's really designed to help people find things that will help them take the risks that they know they're facing and think about what to do next and see what other jurisdictions that are perhaps similarly situated or dealt with similar challenges have done.
It's been a while, but I work for the state of Florida, and I remember looking for state adaptation plans on your site. And it's been forever since I've looked at that particular resource. And I remember the Southeast being lonely because Florida at the time had one. But tell us a bit, what is that state adaptation plan kind of resource?
You're talking about the state progress tracker?
I thought you guys had like a tool where just if you had a state adaptation action plan, then you're just tracking those. So if people from Utah want to be like, oh, what are other states doing? So it's not, is it structured that way, or do I have that wrong?
Yeah, so you can do that on the clearinghouse. You can go on the clearinghouse and right there on the main homepage, there's an option to search by states. So if you are living in Utah and you want to search what resources there are from Utah, you can do that, or Florida or Washington or wherever. But we also have a separate resource on our main website called our State Adaptation Progress Tracker. It's a map that shows all of the states. And initially, it started out as a resource that was tracking how states were implementing their multi-sectoral adaptation plans. So it initially only looked at those like 15 or so states that had plans. And we've shifted a little bit over the years to focus it more broadly on what states are doing in terms of adaptation policy and planning, not necessarily tied to a specific statewide adaptation plan. And we're right now in the middle of a big update to that tool, which is going to expand the research to cover all 50 states. So in the future, you'll be able to come onto that tracker and click on any of those states and see what the state is doing in terms of their governance approach to making decisions about adaptation and resilience, what laws and policies they have that require state or the state itself or local governments to account for climate change impacts, and what they're doing in terms of funding and investment decisions around adaptation. And that resource also links to our clearinghouse. So at the bottom of every state page, there's like a table of resources that tie to the adaptation clearinghouse where you can read more about a specific policy or a specific law that they passed or something like that.
So a lot of information is coming online in this topic area. And so you have a managed retreat toolkit too, right?
We do. We have a handful of toolkits. Our toolkits are designed to go a little bit further in the decision-making process and help a government audience and their partners understand a little bit better the different considerations and trade-offs of adopting a particular policy option, depending on what their context is. They provide different frameworks to help assess which policy tools might be the most appropriate. What are the legal considerations, political, fiscal, or other contexts? What are the socioeconomic considerations? The Managed Retreat Toolkit specifically looks at, initially we had a sea level rise and coastal land use toolkit, which explored different regulatory tools, spending tools, and market-based tools for governments to adapt to sea level rise. And then the Managed Retreat Toolkit came online more recently and took that a little bit further for the specific context of governments that might be thinking about having a comprehensive and longer term strategy for the voluntary movement of people and infrastructure away from areas that are going to be at risk from sea level rise and other coastal impacts. And so it looks at similar options like planning and regulatory tools and what spending tools like buyout programs, market-based tools like transfer of development rights or tax incentives or things like that can help facilitate that overall strategy of shifting away from risky areas.
So you have this broad swath of various resources and different topic areas and such, but which ones, do you have one or two examples, or which ones are the most popular? Which ones do you guys see, oh, wow, people are really using this particular resource?
I would say that our clearinghouse is definitely our most widely used resource. A lot of times it's really the resource out there for adaptation, law, and policy. It fits in that ecosystem of adaptation resources in that planning, law, and policy niche. And we regularly get questions about the clearinghouse. It's so customizable. You can also go on and make an account and save resources that you might want to return to later. So it's a really useful tool and definitely, I would say, our most popular and regularly visited tool.
Let's say you're just an adaptation professional and they're coming to the website. How do you recommend that they get started? Obviously, they're not even quite sure exactly what they would want.
Depending on what level of government you're coming from, I would suggest going to the clearinghouse and maybe exploring. If you're a state government practitioner, you could look at what's been done related to your state, or you could look at a different, like similarly situated state. Perhaps if you're a coastal state and you want to see what another coastal state has done, you can look at that. And the clearinghouse lets you also sort by resource type. If you are interested in what they've done on planning and you're thinking about writing an adaptation plan, you can look at what other governments have done in terms of adaptation planning. Or maybe it's a different type of planning. Maybe you want to integrate adaptation into your hazard mitigation plan and you want to see how other governments have done that. You can look at all kinds of examples there. And then if you are exploring a specific area, that you can also look at our toolkits, which go that next step further, where it'll provide not just information about a particular resource, but decision-making frameworks and trade-offs to consider that can help governments actually decide what is the best approach for them to take. And it also ties case studies back to the clearinghouse. So everything is designed to be very illustrative and show how these policy tools work in practice.
And you guys work directly with partners, right? If someone reaches out to you and if it's overlaps with what you guys do, you'll work directly with people or organizations?
Yeah, definitely. We have done a lot of that, what we call place-based work in the past, where we're partnering with a specific state or local government, and sometimes also with additional partners as well, like CBOs if it's a local jurisdiction. And we will we will work with them on whatever legal or policy questions they have if they're exploring different ways to think about higher regulatory standards, or, for example, for adapting to sea level rise. We will help them explore those questions and different trade-offs of policy tools. So it's definitely been a part of our work in the past. Encourage folks to reach out to us if they have questions like that they'd be interested in exploring with us.
All right. Fantastic. I will have links to your website in my show notes. And thanks, Annie, for coming on and for the work that you guys do.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Allison Smart. Allison is the executive director at Probable Futures, a nonprofit climate literacy initiative. Hi, Allison. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off with the basics for my listeners. What is Probable Futures and what inspired its creation?
Probable Futures is a climate literacy initiative, and what inspired it was the belief that climate action really starts with climate literacy. So what we do is we make climate science accessible and understandable so that everyone, everywhere can think about climate change in really practical ways and prepare for the warming that we're living with today that we've done very little to prepare for, as well as the warming that is highly likely to come in the future. So our goal is really for climate considerations to become an integral part of the decisions people make every day, whether that's at home, whether that is at work, in their whatever their industry is, and also in their communities.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if everyone was climate literate, but who is your target audience? There must be specific users you had in mind.
Well, Probable Futures does three things. Number one, we make available climate literacy material, and in particular, climate model data available via our website to the world for free. So what I mean when I say climate model data is that we have interactive maps that are global in their scope, but able to scale down to a local area. So you can go on these maps, go anywhere in the world, and explore how the weather will change at different levels of warming. So you can explore how heat or humidity or drought or precipitation or wildfire danger will change at a local level. So this is information that really anyone and everyone in every place on Earth really needs to understand to be able to plan for the future. The information and the materials that are available on our website are really geared towards a general audience. So if you're just someone who's curious about climate change, or even if you're somebody who's been working in the renewable energy space for a long time, you are likely to really get something out of the materials that we make available. Now, the second thing that we do is do a lot of executive education. So we're invited into organizations, whether those are for-profit companies at the board level or at the C-suite level, or nonprofit organizations that are working on social issues, and also governments as well. With our executive education programs, our target audience is people who are really responsible for communities, people who have responsibility for risk. And so in many cases, that's people who lead different types of organizations or communities.
I get your newsletter, and it's a great newsletter, and you have these climate explainers, and I just want to put a plug into it. I think yesterday I got the one that was a climate explainer on the climate models, which you just described. It's really quite good. You have a lot of visuals with it, and it's just, I actually learned something. I feel like I've been exposed to a lot of climate modeling literature. So yeah, you guys are putting together some great resources.
Thank you. We have a really talented team working on it, and that is very passionate and dedicated to making climate science as accessible as possible, because it's not just something esoteric or abstract. It is really practical information. We are really guided by the core idea and help people understand that we built all of civilization on a stable climate. So our earliest ancestors emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago. And for the first 190,000 years of our existence, we were a nomadic hunting and gathering species. We were constantly moving around the world. And that all changed in about 9,500 BCE. And we now understand that changed because up until that point, the climate was constantly changing. So our species had to go around the world looking for the nice places to live. But then when the climate stabilized, we were able to do things like practice agriculture, stay in one place, and build long-term communities. And eventually we built up this very complex, very sophisticated civilization that we're living with today. And this very complex civilization is really predicated on the idea that climate stability will continue. So things like building codes are made, so buildings are designed for the climate of the place that you're in. So a building in Phoenix is going to be designed differently than a building in Alaska, for example. What's happening now is that we're losing that stability. Now the climate is changing. We know that it's already changing and will continue to change for some time. And we've never maintained civilization in a changing climate before. So what that means is that we need to have this climate literacy so we can really practically manage through this newfound climate instability. So that's what our team really thinks of it as: very practical, useful information that you need financial literacy or digital literacy to really thrive in the 21st century. Now, climate literacy is one of those things as well.
Well, climate literacy is near and dear to my heart. And I was thinking about this probably 18, 19 years ago. I worked for the State Wildlife Agency in Florida, and they were doing nothing on climate change. And so I created a climate change course to ground them in it. And obviously there was not a lot of material at the time, but I had to sit there and think about what would it mean to be climate literate. And I'm curious, when you guys, I guess even when you started, did you have an idea in mind at the beginning? What's the model climate literate citizen? How did you go through that process?
Yeah, we thought a lot about it. And it really does start with this understanding that civilization was built on a stable climate. So when we all first started doing this, and when I came into the climate change space, because I did not have a background in environmental issues or climate science, I had a career in museums. So I built a career out of helping academics and experts translate their work and tell stories with it in ways that would resonate for general audiences. And I wanted to bring those skills into working in the climate space. So we recognized that there was actually a lot of climate information out there, and a lot of people knew a lot of individual things about climate change, or maybe they had associations with it. So for most people, climate change brings up the image of polar bears and electric cars and fossil fuels and lots of things that are certainly associated with climate change, but that doesn't make it a fundamental understanding of our climate, how it physically works, and how it is physically changing because of climate change. So we really wanted to focus on the physical climate. I think in terms of what climate literacy is, some people might think it's about energy or about carbon, and we really wanted to focus on the weather, how it is changing, and how that intersects with the things that we built in civilization and the things that we care about.
Now, let's talk about credibility. So you're not a government agency, yet your tools are being used by all these different clients that you potentially want to have use it. How do you make sure your data and projections are as reliable and transparent as what we used to think around with NOAA and NASA and all these other data sources?
Yeah. The first answer to that question is that this actually is not our data. So this is data that is technically publicly available. So climate model data is technically publicly available, but it's sitting on servers that very few people know how to access and use. In fact, even only a small slice of the climate science community really knows how to access it and use it. So we are not creating this data. What we are is we are translators. So we're translating the data technologically. So first of all, just into a usable format on the web that anyone can interact with. And then we're also translating it from an intellectual standpoint, helping people understand what it is, how to read it, how to interpret it. So that's the first thing, is that this is information that climate scientists have been building this library of climate model data for the past 40 years. And it comes from research institutions collaborating and national labs collaborating all around the world. So it's well-established data and information. And then we also work with climate scientists to make sure that we are translating it and are making it available in the most responsible, science-driven way. And it's really a great partnership because the scientists make sure that, yes, we're really staying true to the science, but then we as people outside of the climate science community help figure out what questions to ask of the climate data. For example, if you go on our maps, the first map that you'll encounter is the number of days above 90 degrees. And you can, like I said, go to any place, click on a cell, and go through different levels of warming, 1 degree, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3 degrees, and see how the number of days above 90 degrees in that particular place changes over the course of warming. Now, climate models don't necessarily just spit out maps that are days above 90 degrees. We have to say, okay, 90 degrees is an important temperature threshold. It's important for the human body. Bad things start to happen if you get too much over 90 degrees or you spend too much time in that weather. It matters for certain crops. So there are really important crops like corn that aren't as productive over 90 degrees. So it's really this partnership between the scientists and between people like us and the people that we work with who are outside of the climate science community, but are able to bring relevant questions to the climate scientists. So we often say that we built Probable Futures in order to build a bridge between climate science and civilization. We think of climate science as humankind's first truly good forecast. Like, we have never really known that much about the future, but these climate models have been very predictive so far, and they're based on physics. So it really tells us a lot about what the physical climate will be like in the future.
We talked a little bit about this in a previous conversation, and I love talking about adaptation. And so you're out there attending events and conferences, and you still feel there's quite a bit of confusion around adaptation. What did you mean by that?
Sure. I think a lot of people, first of all, there's basic confusion, just what is adaptation? So, for example, we have an explainer on our site that answers the question in plain language, what is adaptation? How should we think about it? Then there's adaptation versus resiliency. Are they the same thing? Are they different things? But really, like I said, adaptation to climate change within civilization is brand new. And that means that we're going to have to define things for the first time and start to develop an understanding and develop best practices for something that we've never done before, but that we have to do. So I think there's, just from that point of view, it's something that's brand new for humanity. Of course, it's not like we have a whole library of information on what works and what doesn't work and how to think about adaptation. We really have to develop that on the fly. But the second thing that I would say is that I think even people who have thought about adaptation at all, or know that it's part of the suite of strategies to address climate change, I think in large part, people think about it as big infrastructure projects or technology, things like vertical farms or a gigantic seawall that could be built around a major city to stave off sea level rise and big storms, that sort of thing. But Adaptation is a lot of things and really should start with just our behavior and our expectations. So using climate model data, developing climate literacy, and thinking about the future and saying to yourself, okay, what I know for sure about the future and in terms of the climate is that it is not going to be the climate of the past. And so we want to help people really think through that entire spectrum of adaptation from those basics to understanding strategies that are big things like infrastructure and everything in between.
Accessibility is a big part of what you're doing there. How do you make sure your tools and materials reach the people and the communities that need them the most, not just well-resourced organizations?
Yeah. Number one, we make it free. When we first started Probable Futures, there were quite a few climate intelligence companies that were spinning up, that were getting lots of venture capital funding, and that would charge pretty high fees for to analyze climate data and provide climate risk analyses. And we don't necessarily have a problem with those kinds of organizations existing, but we do have a problem if that's the only way that one could access this information. Like I said, this is humankind's first good forecast. It is completely relevant to everyone in the world, no matter where you are. And so it really should be a public utility. So we set out to make it a public utility and to make it accessible in all the ways that we've talked about and free. We fund the organization by raising money from philanthropy in order to be able to make all of this available for free and make sure that it's well maintained too. I think the internet is littered with tools and projects that maybe got started at one point and got some funding, but that weren't maintained over time. And we're really committed to maintaining this as a public resource. The second way that we make sure that it gets into the hands of people that we need it is by partnering with organizations. We recognize that our little organization can only do so much, even if we build the free resource that's available on the web. And so we partner with humanitarian aid organizations and community-based organizations and help train them to understand how climate change and how this information intersects with their work so that they can then translate the resources and the ideas and in some cases even the data within their communities. So our approach is really not that everyone would have to come to Probable Futures, but that there might be little Probable Futures all over the place. And that is happening. So with some organizations, they might incorporate our data and our maps into their own tools. And we do make it available in a way that we have a really accessible API. It's completely open source. And we even have staff that helps. We really look for organizations that have that network effect, that have their own community where we can engage with them and then they could disseminate it much farther than we ever could, and that they can disseminate it in a way that makes sense for their communities and where they can be the messenger for. It doesn't make sense for us to parachute into different communities and wag our finger and say, this is what climate change is going to mean for you. Our goal is to help communities develop that climate literacy and empower them so they can do this thinking and this planning and advocate for their communities on their own without having to depend on people like us.
So you just gave a lot of great advice if groups want to get your help starting using the information that you have. But if someone's randomly coming to your website, what's the best way for them to start using Probable Futures? They get there. Sometimes you're overwhelmed with things and just what kind of advice would you give that kind of person?
I would advise them to spend some time with our climate handbook. So the climate handbook is, again, really beautifully designed and well-written material that brings you through heat, water, land, and risk, which we think are the fundamentals of understanding physical climate change. And you can read it in sequence. So we actually wrote it in sequence. So if you start with the heat volume, we will start you with the basics, and then we will work you up from there. That's what I would suggest is first engaging with our climate handbook. There's a tour where you can get some advice about how to use it, but it's also really interesting to just poke around. And there's lots of interpretation within those maps. So there's lots of explainers. But yeah, I would start with the climate handbook for sure.
Fantastic. Allison, thanks for what you're doing and thanks for coming on the podcast. And I'll have links in my show notes for this episode for people who want to explore deeper into probable futures. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Dr. Deb Rudnick. Deb is a senior scientist with EcoAdapt. Hi, Deb. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
All right. Before we jump into the resources that you're going to be here talking about, what is EcoAdapt?
EcoAdapt. We are a nonprofit organization that is focused on climate change adaptation, supporting communities, institutions, and agencies around the country and across the world as we can to support them in their climate adaptation journey.
Laura Hansen, your executive director, she and I go way back, and she was actually one of my first interviews on this podcast 8 or 9 years ago. So yeah, great to connect again with your group. First off, given the retreat on many federal resources, how do you see EcoAdapt stepping in to support adaptation professionals and communities?
Yes, we have long been in the business of focusing on climate change adaptation, and that means several different things. We ourselves do research in this space, trying to advance this field of adaptation. We do direct support of communities and agencies that are trying to do this work and help them think through how to integrate adaptation planning into whatever it is that they're working on. We support conferences, webinars, and just cross connectivity to help people get access to more training and knowledge in this arena in a whole variety of ways.
So we're going to go through a handful of these tools that you guys have. And I want to start off with the Adaptation Help Desk. What is that?
So the Adaptation Help Desk is a relatively new tool. It is housed in the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is a program of underneath NOAA. And it is there to help you ask questions that you can't easily find answers to. It really is designed to be a resource to support our adaptation practitioners and folks working in the adaptation space. It came out of the Climate Smart Communities Initiative project because we wanted some additional tools to help support that community of grantees, but we also wanted it to be more broadly accessible to the adaptation space and people working in that space. So it literally is a website you go into. There are some FAQs about what adaptation is and its multiple components. You can learn a little bit more and get connected to resources on everything from exposure and vulnerability assessments to how to find funding, to how to prioritize adaptation solutions. So it runs the whole gamut of kind of the resilience planning pathway. But if you're not finding what you need there, you can actually type a question into the prompt box and it will be answered by a real live human being who works in adaptation, myself, or someone else in our team that is there to help folks get the answers that they need.
Next up is the Registry of Adaptation Practitioners. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, so the Registry of Adaptation Practitioners is another tool that was developed in association with our Climate Smart Communities program. And the idea behind this is we wanted a way to make it easier for folks that were looking for support. And the context is we wanted a tool that was available to grantees or applicants for climate smart communities so they could more easily find adaptation practitioners that they had confidence could provide them with the knowledge and support they needed to do resilience work. But again, even though the registry itself is associated with climate smart communities, it's open to anyone who is interested in applying or using that registry to either become a registered adaptation practitioner or to find someone if you have needs in the resilience space. So It is free to apply. And anyone can dig in and use it and use filters to try to link to someone that's really working on the issues that they're interested in.
So it's my understanding you can sign up as an individual, but people can sign up, let's say, organizationally too. Let's say you work for a company, so that you can search that way too, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we have single shingle folks that are doing independent consulting all the way up to very large consulting firms or institutions, university affiliated centers. We have a whole range of different folks that are in the registry.
So people can register, and the whole point is to connect people out in this field. Have you heard how a community or an organization has used the registry to actually connect with other folks in the field?
It really is an opportunity, a tool for folks that are working as practitioners in the resilience space and folks that are trying to get their communities or agencies or institutions farther along that resilience pathway to connect with each other and find the support they need. And we have some indications from the Climate Smart Communities program that is how it's being used. There are some folks that are diving into the registry in order to pair up with someone to create a grant application to get more funding and support to do that work.
All right, folks, go up and sign up in the registry. Next tool up is CAKE, and that's the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. And just it's been around for a while. It was around when I was in a previous career. So you guys have been doing that for a while. Tell us what that's about.
Yeah. So the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE, is a database of all kinds of tools and resources about adaptation. It contains hundreds of case studies, resources, adaptation planning tools, a whole variety of things that are searchable and sortable by geography, by climate hazards, by different ways you can dive in and find the information that you need. But CAKE is also even broader than that. CAKE is a source for information about events and opportunities happening in the climate adaptation space. We have a list of job opportunities. We have grant opportunities. You can sign up for our monthly slice of cake, which hands you a lot of this stuff neatly packaged, including if we have new resources that we've recently added to the database. We'll highlight some of those as well. And then one of the things we've been working on more recently is what we're calling the monitoring and evaluation dashboard. So EcoAdapt is really interested in building information around what works in climate adaptation. We're really interested in effectiveness. What's working and why is it working? Or maybe what's not working? What are the barriers to keeping things from working or being applied in various spaces? So we're trying to build up a component of CAKE that really speaks to that. And we love folks who are working in the effectiveness space, who are evaluating adaptation and trying to figure out what's working, to reach out to us because we want to build that content and make that available.
My understanding, you actually have to sign in to CAKE, but then anyone could add content to it at any time, right?
Yeah, there's a link to add content, and we will get that information from you and curate that in a way that kind of standardizes the way it's presented to our readers so that they come to expect a certain amount of overview and then a link to the resource itself. But absolutely, we welcome content. We're always trying to build content on that site.
Speaking of content potentially be taken away, you have a page that lists all these federal resources. It's really a huge library, but things have changed. Have you guys gone in and checked if those things are still available?
Oh, it's so funny you should ask that. We're actually working on a paper right now, looking at the state of federal tools. And yes, we are constantly looking at whether or not websites are relevant, and we're trying to do this in a somewhat systematic way right now. We're also making use of a website. Oh, Doug, I'm going to forget the name of what the acronym stands for. EDGI, which is a federal environmental data and governance initiative. And this website is tracking changes in websites. And so that is a great help to us because they're doing a lot of this work more broadly than in just climate adaptation, but there's some cross-pollination with the types of checks that we're trying to do as well. So it's a really helpful resource as well.
Hopefully, when we have saner leadership, that these resources will be available for future federal employees, because we're losing a lot of it. Like those folks there, that there's a record of this. So hopefully they'll be put to use. And like, all right, how do we recreate this?
Exactly. And there are a number of entities, including us, that are trying to save websites and content that we feel is really critically important. So, for instance, we downloaded and have available the National Climate Assessment on our website because that's no longer being hosted by the federal government. So you can find that with us as well.
I guess it's considered a tool, but I just want to end here with you guys host the National Adaptation Forum every 2 years. Give us a little bit of background about the forum.
Yes. So the National Adaptation Forum has been going on since 2013. It happens every 2 years, a little bit of a shimmy for COVID, and it moves around the country. And it really is designed as a space for adaptation practitioners to come together, learn about the work that we're all doing, share successes, share barriers, share training and tools that we think would be effective for other folks who are in this sphere as well. So this year in 2026, the National Adaptation Forum is coming to Pittsburgh, May 12th through 14th. We're really excited to host that event coming up. And we've had a record number of proposals sent in. So we think that's really encouraging. There seems to be a lot of interest in meeting up and collaborating as a community. So that's really exciting.
Okay, so you've said it, but I want you to do one last sort of pep talk of who should show up to this event, because I think the more diverse the audience, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So who should show up? I'll start by who does tend to show up to this event. We have a pretty diverse audience. It is a good mix of about a third nonprofits, a third government, and a whole mix of university, private sector, students, and a range of other folks that attend. They come from all over the country. They represent early, mid, late career professionals. So it's a really nice, diverse mix in terms of where people are, how much experience they've had in the climate adaptation space. And they work on a huge variety of topics. I mean, we have dozens of topics that are represented in the forum and in the sessions, everything from public health and climate to natural resource management, tribal governance, managed retreat. If you can think of a climate adaptation topic, it's probably represented at the forum. And that's really what we're aiming for, because we want to reach folks across the variety of issues that they're working on. And this is a very wide field. As you well know, this spans policy, engineering, science, the whole gamut of the types of work and the expertise. And it all has to come together for it to work. Climate adaptation obviously is a diverse field that takes a whole variety of folks with a wide range of talents to approach these issues.
Yes, and I encourage my listeners, and there's a lot of adaptation and resilience conferences popping up all over the place, and they're covering a lot of different bases. But I would say NAF is like this senior elder statesman in this whole system. Been around. 2013 doesn't sound like that long ago, but it's actually like a long time ago compared to what's been happening in the adaptation space. So yeah, you guys check it out. And just, I love going just because I get to meet a lot of listeners. That's always fun. And yeah, it's a great event. I missed the last one, but I'm planning to be in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's a great town. Okay, Deb. So I'm going to have links to all these resources in the show notes for this episode. One, thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you and lots of other folks at the forum.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap. A huge thanks to all my guests for sharing their time, their expertise, and the incredible tools they've built or are building to keep this work moving forward. And please, don't just listen and move on. Consider supporting these organizations, especially climate.us, who are still getting on their feet and already doing essential work. In fact, since our original interview, they've added even more resources. So take a look. Links are in my show notes. And for the foundation folks listening, don't be shy. This is exactly the kind of effort that needs your backing. It's a sobering time in the adaptation space and in the broader field of climate change. But moments like this also open the door for real innovation, new ideas, new partnerships, and a new ecosystem of climate services that can rise to meet the challenge. Let's use this moment to create big things together. This episode is not an exhaustive list of everything out there, not even close, but I hope it gives you a solid starting point. You all, the people listening to the show, are some of the smartest, hardest working adaptation professionals out there. If there are tools you rely on or new resources you're building, let me know. I'm happy to add them to the show notes so more people can find what they need. This podcast is a platform for all of us. If you found this episode useful, please share it with a colleague. Someone out there is scrambling for data or guidance, and one click from you could put a critical resource in their hands. Post this episode on your LinkedIn account. Communications is adaptation. The more we understand the landscape, the better decisions we'll make. You sharing these tools, these stories, and this knowledge is part of the solution. Once again, I want to acknowledge that this episode was generously sponsored by the CO2 Foundation. I can only continue to do what I'm doing and sharing these climate adaptation stories through sponsorships. The foundation is doing amazing work supporting some really innovative projects. And as you have heard me talk frequently on this podcast, very few foundations fund adaptation communications. The CO2 Foundation has funded some great projects focusing on that. Definitely check out their website to look at the fantastic work that they're funding. And also thanks to my strategy partner, Adam Thaler, for his partnership working with the CO2 Foundation. Thank you, Adam. Keep on fishing. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.